All right, I'm not going to take much time to introduce people at all. We're going to be relatively informal. The idea is that each of our guests will speak for 8 to 10 minutes, and then we will take questions from the audience, which I'm sure there will be several. I may choose to take 2 or 3 at a time and select from those one, and then do that again, and we'll try to wrap this up by about 5 or certainly by 10 o'clock. Just quickly, because there's no name tags, Marc Chandler is sitting next to me. David Malpass, all the names and bios are in the material that you have. Myself, Juan Parez-Campanero, and then we have Paul Sheard here as well. So I'm going to turn it over. We'll just go right across here and turn it over at this point to Marc.
Good morning. Thank you very much. Maybe just to begin the discussion, I can suggest instead of talking about point forecasts of GDP or the dollar, let me give you the general interpretive framework that I'm developing. First thing I'd say is that to compare what we're going through now worldwide, I think is a lot like the 1970s. Here's how I see it happening. At the end of World War II, there was the Bretton Woods era. The dollar was pegged to gold. Other currencies were pegged to the dollar. There was limited capital mobility. Men's wages, and I mean men, specifically the gender, men's wages were tied to productivity or inflation. My father was a plumber. He was able to support a stay-at-home wife and 4 children on one man's income. And this is before plumbers were drain surgeons, as they are today. What happened? Something happened in the late 60s, early 70s. Men's wages no longer were linked to productivity and inflation. The Bretton Woods system itself collapsed when Nixon had the final shot, closing the gold window August 15, 1971. For about a decade, we didn't know what was happening. The malaise in America that Carter made references about. The idea that we in the United States, I think, we can produce a lot of goods, but one of the things we really produce well is we can turn a necessity into a virtue. Women entered the workforce in huge numbers. Why? Because men's wages no longer kept pace with inflation. My mother had to go to work. As Nixon was putting on wage and price controls in the early 70s, little did we know that that system had collapsed and that Reagan and Thatcher were around the corner. They were around the corner, which meant we couldn't see them. The Reagan-Thatcher model was meant to address the problems of the Bretton Woods model that had broken down. It posed decoupling in a very formal way the wages and productivity, capital mobility, currencies floated, women entered the workforce, huge numbers. The technology under Bretton Woods was the disbursement and penetration of white goods into the household, dishwashers, washing machines, the kind of technologies that developed and expanded in the post-World War II period. The technology associated with Reagan and Thatcher, I would think, would be like computers. I used to have this stock account. I only put Intel and Microsoft into it, my Wintel account. That system that Reagan and Thatcher ushered in, that has lasted us for, I would think, from early 1980s to roughly 2000, 2001, has broken down. In the beginning of this crisis, I thought all we had to do was fix the antenna like we did in 1990, like we did in 2000. Just a little kicking the machine to make sure it was working a little bit better, a little tweak. But now it's become clear that that system's broken down. We don't know what's really going to replace it yet, in the same way that we didn't know what was going to replace the Bretton Woods system when it initially broke down. This is going to be a prolonged transition period. I think we already see some signs of what this new era is going to be. Let me just mention a few of them. I think that capitalism, political economy, is about relationships. And I think several of the relationships are going to change profoundly in the years ahead. These relationships include the relationship between the citizen and the sovereign, the relationship between employees and employers. I think it's also going to affect gender relations in a very profound way. More women in college than men. More women in many graduate school programs, maybe not all the MBA programs, but many MBA programs. And not only are women more in the university and colleges, but they're doing better than men. Work is going to be feminized going forward, whether we like it or not. Whether we want to embrace it or not, I think these relationships are so profound. The changing of the political economy is going to change these relationships. Technology. We're already beyond the post, as you were saying, introduction, giving people the Twitter. We're in a post-PC world. The technology is changing. We're more mobile. At Brown Brothers, where I work, we have several people in the foreign exchange group that have flexible work schedules where they can work at home 1 or 2 days a week. That's the future. And I wonder if for many of us in high-income countries, I wonder if our children are going to be able to live as good as we do. I think that at the same time that we have lower ability to produce these goods, I think we also have an environmental movement that's going to make it okay to have lower expectations. For example, instead of in the U.S., for example, we have a licensed car for we have a car for every licensed driver. Do we really think the world capacity can hold China and India getting to those same levels? I think about zip cars. I think about water usage. You know, in the U.S., I was talking to someone before the program. In the U.S. And Canada, we go through about 150 gallons of water per day per person. The World Health Organization says all we need is 20. That counts the food we eat as well as hygiene. So I wonder if our children and our grandchildren have to use water conservation, white goods in the house like dishwashers, washing machines, where they have to eat less red meat, which is a big source of the water demand. I wonder if this is managing expectations at the same time we can produce less, generate less. So I leave you with that idea that this framework that we're used to, the relationships that have characterized the Reagan-Thatcher era that I think has ended, and we're working on this new era, and I think that thinking about things as relationships and seeing how those relationships are going to be transformed, even though we can't quite see how we're going to accumulate capital and where's the source going to be for aggregate demand going forward. I think those are unknowns. I think for me they're beyond my ken. Maybe there's smarter people who could figure that out. I just don't see it quite yet, but I feel confident that things are going to happen, that we're moving in the right direction, even if it takes us several more years to get there. So thank you very much.
Interesting, Marc. Thank you very much. Interesting big picture perspective that one doesn't often hear. David?
Yeah. Thank you, Archibald, and thank you, Noel. I'm going to offer a small picture perspective, so following on. My company is in SEMA Global. I do economic, global, macro kind of research, so I'll try to interweave it with markets and what's been happening. My colleague Eric Barkley is here, and I'm very happy to see everyone in the audience. So picking up on where Marc left off, if we think of an ideal growth environment, we've strayed very far away from it. An ideal growth environment is one, I think, unarguably, where you have some form of limited government, meaning not unlimited government. That seems to be self-evident. And then you need to have reasonably low tax rates, because if you have high tax rates, it distorts what people do. You need a liberal trading environment. And I think what you need is stable currencies so that the private sector doesn't have to deal with the massive fluctuations in currency values. So if we think of that as an idealized framework, then we can examine each of the major problems going on in the world. In Europe, Europe is important to the US and to the world, very important at this particular time from a financial standpoint, because their banks, they allowed to get really, really big. If we think ours are too big to fail, Europe's bank assets, just the Eurozone, not counting Britain, the Eurozone's bank assets are 3.5 times bigger than the US. They've got $42 trillion in assets on the balance sheets of banks versus, say, $12.5 trillion in the US. So that gives you a magnitude of why everybody's worried about Europe. And then the second thing is they've grouped a bunch of countries together under one currency. I happen to think that's a step forward because it was a stable currency. It was basically conceptually like Germany sharing the Deutschmark with everybody else in Europe. And it had huge networking gains. And so the living standards of people in Greece and in Spain and elsewhere went up rapidly, and that was a good for the world, good for everybody. The problem, obviously, is they didn't enforce their own rules on fiscal deficit limitations, and so you had huge borrowing out of Greece, Spain, and the other countries, way beyond what they could afford to pay back. So now we're stuck with a problem, and the problem is, in my mind, you need structural reforms in the periphery, and you're not getting them. Germany is pushing structural reforms that the countries can't do. I've advocated a different form of structural reforms where the governments in Greece and Spain and elsewhere downsize themselves first before putting the austerity on the private sector. So they have to show leadership out of their own house before trying to raise the value-added taxes to unbearable levels, as they've done under their current program. So Germany is pushing hard in a direction that I think won't work. I think Europe's now beyond salvage. And so we're seeing Europe moving into a very deep recession in the periphery, and Germany looks like it's heading into recession now. So I think that spells global recession in 2013 as Europe begins to sink. Second, I want to mention China and then the U.S., and then that'll be it, Archibald. On China, they're slowing fast. And so earlier in the year, I had thought that China would invoke some monetary stimulus more than they've done. They've cut the interest rate twice, they've cut the reserve requirement 3 times, but the levels are still very high on both. And so China is, to an extent, reflecting the slowdown in global growth. We look at China and say, well, they ought to be the engine of growth. They don't, that's not exactly their responsibility. They're supposed to do well by themselves, and what they've decided is to wait and see how far the world slows down and then start their stimulus programs. What that means, though, is China is not adding to the global growth right now. It's, as a rate of change, is contributing to the slowdown, and I think that will extend into 2013. Even if they started their stimulus program now, which there are not signs that they're doing, they wouldn't be able to catch up by the time the U.S. and Europe pull us down toward recession. On the U.S. side, I've been quite critical of the Federal Reserve for expanding its role. So as you look at bond purchases by the Federal Reserve, I think that actually becomes contractionary. It's not a point of diminishing returns for the Fed to buy bonds. They're actually changing the nature of our financial system as they buy up the government debt. It channels money into the things that they've decided to buy. So they've been buying government bonds and government guaranteed mortgages. And so that means the prices of those two things go up. And so the world produces more of those. So you get bigger U.S. government, more government mortgages, and it comes out of the pocket of everyone else. The amount of private sector credit in the U.S. hasn't been growing, and yet more credit is going to big corporations that can issue these low-yield bonds. And so that's a rechanneling of credit toward bigness in the U.S. that has quite negative growth effects. On the tax policy side, we have the huge tax increase at year end. I worked on the '86 Tax Act when I was in the Reagan administration, and I know how hard it was then to get it done, and it's twice as hard now to get a tax reform through the U.S. Congress or even designed within Washington. So the problem for the private sector is you're looking at massive uncertainty as we go into 2013. And that's negative for growth. I want to mention spending and debt. So in addition to the tax problem, we have a government that's now spending $3.8 trillion. So this is a massive expansion of the government and its influence within the private sector. And so that by itself subtracts from growth because it diverts and channels resources away from a market-based system toward a government-based system. By early 2013, we're going to face the debt limit increase, which is right now it's almost $16.4 trillion. And I've advocated, and I'll advocate to this audience, that law is a very harmful law because if you don't comply with it, you can't issue more debt, and you rush the world into kind of a default scenario. We saw a little taste of it in August of 2011. So the right way for the government to approach it is admit that the law that we're operating under, called a debt limit law, is actually designed. It was originally designed to facilitate the issuance of debt by the government. And so we've tried to convert its use into controlling it, which it was never designed to do. So the right way to approach it is to repeal the current law and rewrite a law that actually limits spending when you've got too much debt in the federal government. So that would be an approach that would break us out of this. So concluding on Marc's point, we had a world that used to work on a market-based system to create more growth, and we've departed from that in a lot of areas that, to me, spell a recession in 2013. Thanks.
Thank you. Now I suspect we may head more into the situation in Europe and in Spain. Juan, go ahead.
Yes, thank you. Thank you all for the invitation. Thank you for being here. And let me try to give you an European angle. And it's really difficult to be constructive or positive on Europe, definitely, because Europe is being bad news for the world. It's been a drag on growth, and it's been a source of financial instability that is having a negative effect on everybody. Let me start off first by making a general, more broader observation about the state of the world in recent years and also going forward. One of the most salient features of economic developments is the striking divergence of performance between emerging markets and advanced economies. Advanced economies, for instance, measures of high-frequency indicators of activity such as industrial production, it collapsed around 19% as an aggregate for all advanced economies. Still is about 8% below the previous peak prior to the crisis, whereas for emerging markets as a whole, it took less than a year, just 11 months, to get back to the previous peak, and they are now around 29% above that peak. The bulk of global growth has been coming from emerging markets, is likely to continue to come in the near future, but also in the long run. I mean, when you look at the kind of indicators that tend to influence the ability to grow for the economies, such as the investment in human capital, it's interesting that, for instance, in the PISA study on education on the OECD, 4 of the top 5 performing countries are coming from emerging Asia. When they ask how many kids can solve new problems they were not trained to solve using the tools they can manage, about 25% of the kids in the Shanghai area can do that. Only 4% of the kids in Finland, the best performing country in Europe, can do that. So that has tended to have also an implication on the fiscal space, because we have witnessed a much more significant deterioration of fiscal positions in advanced economies. It will take us a lot more substantial effort to go back to the pre-crisis levels on our fiscal metrics. That's even without taking into account the effects of aging of the population that, of course, affects more severely advanced economies. Now, turning a bit into the European situation, as you are probably well aware of, the European economy is very weak now, but it's even weaker than it looks on first sight, or you just look at the average or aggregate levels. As you heard talk about the double dip in the US recurrently over the last 2 or 3 years, you never heard that in Europe, but that was completely deceiving, because it was almost entirely based on the strength or resilience of Germany. Germany represents less than 30% of the GDP of the euro area, and it has contributed 72% of the increase in output since the end of the 2008-2009 recession. So the rest of the region, excluding Germany, has already been in recession for 4 quarters since the 3rd quarter of last year, and it's getting weaker. And the bad news is that the German economy is now also capitulating. All the advanced indicators are plunging. The indicators of future activities, such as the manufacturing PMIs, have been in contraction now for 6 months running. They're even below the region average. Unemployment that has been decreasing for the best part of the last 3 years has been now rising for the last 5 months in a row, which is the worst strike since 2009. Retail sales are barely at the level they were at the end of 2008. So that sets the region on a very poor situation. So why is the region in recession? Is that surprising? I mean, when you think about it, Europe has been facing a number of headwinds on growth. Now we have a central bank that's a lot more proactive on growth and more flexible towards financial markets. But before that, under Trichet, it was not the case. I mean, and believe it or not, Europe was not lowering rates. It was actually hiking rates in 2011. They did it twice in 2011. Now, higher rates are bad for growth, but the important thing is that they're differentially worse for some countries. Those countries that are weaker, those in the periphery, are more exposed to short-term rates because a larger part of the mortgage market is indexed to floating rates. Now, the currency. Europe doesn't have a foreign currency policy. There's no one really in charge of the FX. So when other geographies try to directly, overtly, or covertly to implement orchestrated depreciation of the currency, Europe does nothing. So the euro went from say 160 to the dollar to around 115 was good news for exporters, but the trip back from 115 to 140 or now around 130 is clearly bad news. Again, differentially bad news across the Eurozone because some countries are more sensible to prices. Germany is less price sensitive, has lower elasticities to exchange rate than other geographies. But it is, first and foremost, all about fiscal consolidation. If you recall, you were moved back 2 or 3 years ago, the US was coming to the G8 and proposing, okay, let's not go crazy on the fiscal front, but let's try to get out of this recession by a moderate fiscal expansion that is coordinated on a global scale so that it's more effective. So Japan said, okay, we'll play along in our own way, but Europe said, no, thanks, we'll keep on. We're at our one-way bet on austerity. And everything you do to improve your fiscal metrics is going to be detrimental to growth. Now, how bad on growth will depend on how you do it. Depend when it goes to the revenue side or the spending side, what type of revenues or type of spending. But roughly speaking, as a rule of thumb, for every percentage point of GDP of fiscal contraction, of fiscal adjustment, you get a 0.6% less growth on the economy. And that's what's happening in Europe. Europe has been falling the so-called austerity trap. I mean, you engage in aggressive fiscal consolidation, which undermines growth, and then the market doesn't entirely believe you're going to be able to deliver on your promises on the fiscal numbers, which lets countries to engage in an additional round of fiscal consolidation, which kills growth further, and suddenly you're into a downward spiral. But even more than on the cyclical perspective, I think we should worry about the long-term situation of Europe. Europe doesn't look good from a long-term or structural perspective. When you look around the world, I mean, most people around the world tend to work around 1,800 hours per worker per year. Some countries, they work 2,000, some countries 2,200. Well, in Europe, nobody works. I mean, it's 1,400 to 1,600 per worker per year, because they retire so early. There are some countries like Belgium where only, believe it or not, only 17% of males over 55 are active on the workforce. So there's no way you can expect, to generate the same level of income and wealth that is generated in other parts of the world. Now, if we move briefly to the sovereign crisis, and that's what's really concentrating the attention of everybody. Well, essentially, we're dealing with a problem of sustainability. It's all about leverage and sustainability of the debt. Your debt is sustainable depending on the interplay between your debt levels, your primary, meaning excluding interest payments deficit, and your nominal GDP growth. So whenever you have either high level of debt or low growth, or you're facing high funding costs, you're in trouble, which many of these countries are. Some of them are outright insolvent, like Greece is totally insolvent. Depending, it doesn't matter which numbers you throw in, the metrics look awful. So there's nothing to do about Greece other than what we have done, a debt relief program together with some trying to ensure they behave fiscally from here on. For most other countries, it's really more of a liquidity issue rather than a solvency issue, but that's not reassuring. Liquidity issues turn into solvency issues very quickly. as the experience in emerging markets has shown over and over again. Just to give you a recent example, Romania in 2008 had a debt to GDP ratio of only 21%. Nevertheless, they had to go to the IMF for financial assistance. So think for a minute, let's take a step back and think what characterizes typically an emerging market. From an academic viewpoint is one that typically the debt, government liabilities are denominated in a foreign currency. In such a situation, and they cannot get out, when foreign investors don't trust the country and sell the bonds, you cannot take care of that by a devaluation, because that will increase your debt servicing cost. What they do, they typically try to show their willingness to repay the debt by engaging in aggressive fiscal consolidation programs, which kills growth, which makes them more difficult, and suddenly you're in a sort of self-fulfilling crisis. Now consider the euro area countries. I mean, and just as a metaphor, consider one country that's inside and one country that is outside the monetary union. Say one country outside, like the UK. If foreigners sell the bonds, that means that the currency will tend to depreciate, so your growth will go up, your inflation will go up, so your nominal growth will go up, your debt sustainability metrics improves. The money doesn't really leave the country, because if foreign investor sells, there may be other local investors that can buy, and there is no domestic investor, the central bank can buy it. Actually, that's more or less what happened in the UK. In a country inside the euro, consider for instance Portugal. Foreigners sell the bonds, there's no currency effect because you're tied to the euro. The money does leave the country because these people selling Portuguese bonds to buy German bonds. And the government of Portugal cannot really force the central bank to buy, to take up the slack, because they don't really control. It's a federal institution. So in essence, they're in the same situation that emerging markets have been, for decades. So they have become de facto emerging markets in a sense, in that broad economic sense, and therefore liable to this type of sudden stop, self-fulfilling crisis that have plagued emerging markets forever. Now, the good news about that is that we know from the experience of handling emerging market crisis that if it's only a liquidity crisis and you provide enough liquidity, normally it tends to get solved. Out of 120 cases of assistance by the IMF, only 19 episodes ended up in restructuring or the debt or default, which is a remarkable success ratio. But the issue here is that we're dealing with a problem of such huge dimensions that it's almost unmanageable. The biggest defaults in history that we had from sovereigns were around the order of $80 billion, Argentina or Russia. I mean, here we're talking, Greece alone, we're roughly close to $500 billion. If we move all the way to Italy, it's north of $2 trillion. So it's so huge. It doesn't compare to anything we have seen before. And it's so intimately intertwined with the financial sector that it's also very difficult to tackle. But one important thing to bear in mind is that all European Union issues cannot be understood from a purely economic perspective. They have a political angle. Monetary union was never predicated on the basis of its economic properties. It was not a brilliant economic idea. It was done because people in Europe never wanted to live again through the intra-European wars that had been recurrent through history, and they thought that to prevent that, they needed some sort of economic integration. Economic integration was an integral part of that, and monetary integration was also an integral part of that. So doing away with that will also entail giving up the whole project. So that's why sometimes things don't make too much sense economically speaking, but there is a political angle. Let me start wrapping up here because we need to move forward. So even it's clear that there's an issue of diverging competitiveness trends in Europe, but also you should look back in history and look at how current account positions have developed. When we lock exchange rates with the euro, they were probably looking at very uncompetitive levels for the countries in the periphery, so that in the 10 years prior to EMU, actually Germany was not running a current account surplus, was very often running a deficit that was actually twice the size of the sum of Italy plus Spain plus Portugal plus Greece, and then suddenly things started to massively develop, diverge, with the Germany generating a current account surplus and the other countries a deficit, we shows the dysfunctionality of the system. At the same time, we had negative real interest rates prevailing because we were financing the German reunification, and Germany was repressing consumption to the benefit of the manufacturing exporting sector. So the choice for these countries in the periphery was tough: either deflate their economies to regain competitiveness, or in an environment of negative real interest rates, let their economic agents leverage up. That's what they did, and it's finally blowing up on our faces with a very difficult solution. On the solutions, we'll go later on the Q&A.
We haven't heard. We haven't heard what's going to happen to Greece, but that's another matter, or Spain. Paul.
Great, thank you very much. Well, the global outlook. We think the global economy, at least most of it, is still expanding, not Europe at the moment, but the outlook is very precarious indeed. That would be the single word I would really underscore here. And the context is extremely important for looking at the global outlook. We are just 4 years out from the greatest financial crisis and global recession since the Great Depression. And if you overlaid things on that timeline, we would be basically in around about 1933. That's not to draw any predictions here, but just to underscore what is at stake in the policy management in the global economy. Now, there are really 3 risks, and they've been touched on here already. Let me go through them one by one. One is, of course, the Eurozone crisis. Now, the Eurozone is back in recession. 4 years out from this great financial crisis and global recession, having started to recover, you do not want to be going back into recession. That's a very bad place to be. But the Eurozone is there. We forecast a contraction in the Eurozone overall of about 0.8%, close to 1% this year, maybe flat growth next year. Why is that a problem? Well, if you look at the Eurozone as a whole, GDP fell in the financial crisis and the recession by about 6.8%, actually 5.6%, sorry, so roughly 6%. But it's still more than 2% below that pre-crisis peak, and it's heading back into recession. Now, we know why that's the case. It's this Eurozone crisis. What is that all about? Some of the key points have been touched upon. But what I would underscore here is that the Eurozone crisis, which is kind of the second phase of this financial crisis that began in 2008, is all about a crisis of a flawed architecture. It's a problem which emanates from 17 countries, the members of the Eurozone, having entered into a complete monetary union, but not having entered into a fiscal union. In fact, the fiscal arrangements were essentially to apply fiscal straitjackets to each country. Now, why is that a problem? Well, fast forward to 2009 when the economy was in recession. Take a country in the periphery. It's in recession against a backdrop of a very bad global financial crisis and recession. It's come to light that these countries have lost competitiveness and they have huge debt problems, some in the public sector, some in the private sector. What do you do next? Well, typically in that kind of situation, of course, you need to do some structural reforms, you need to worry about the rules of the game, but you have to make sure you get the economy growing again so that you can tackle those structural reform issues. You don't want to push the economy deeper into recession. But as an economist, I think in terms of margins of adjustment. What sort of margins of adjustment did these economies have? Well, because they were in a monetary union, they didn't have the normal margin of adjustment of monetary policy, because that was delegated to Frankfurt, to the ECB, and the exchange rate. Normally in these situations, you could bet your bottom dollar, so to speak, that the exchange rate would depreciate, but Greece, Spain, Italy, they don't have an exchange rate anymore. It's pegged essentially to the Deutschmark. Those margins of adjustments were not there. The third margin of adjustment would be the fiscal margin of adjustment. So if you were in a monetary union and you're also in a fiscal union and you dug yourself into a deep hole, at least you could save yourself from a Great Depression or a default because you get a fiscal helping hand from your partners in the monetary union. That's the situation in the US, in Australia, the country that I come from. In most countries where the monetary union matches the fiscal union. That is not the case in Eurozone. They did not have the fiscal union. That then led to, obviously, an exacerbation of the crisis. In fact, it's worse than that because we've heard about austerity. The dial, the fiscal dial, was essentially turned in the contractionary direction. So no ability to have an exchange rate depreciation, no ability to have your own independent monetary easing, no fiscal helping hand, and essentially fiscal contraction. The theory here being that competitiveness had drifted that drifted out of line in these periphery countries, to stay in the monetary union and to narrow those competitiveness differentials, you would need to undergo a domestic deflation to get the real exchange rate back in line. Obviously, that's a recipe for a very bad outcome, and we've seen that very bad outcome. Let me just give you a statistic. I mentioned the Eurozone before. What about Italy, for example? Well, Italy's GDP in the crisis fell 7.1% in this so-called recovery. It's only increased 0.3%. So the level of GDP in Italy, as we speak today, is still 6.8% below the pre-crisis peak, and it's back in recession, and it's getting worse. So if something's not sustainable, something will happen. And what is happening in Europe is there is a margin of adjustment, which is the fiscal margin of adjustment. It's coming back into play. First, we had the Greek bailout, 110 billion euro. Then we had the EFSF, pardon me. Then we had the ESM. Now we have the ECB, OMT. Sorry for the acronyms. The point is, at every point when the Eurozone has been facing either a breakup or you move down the path towards fiscal union, because that's a fiscal helping hand. Think of it as a fiscal helping hand, because that's the only margin of adjustment that will keep these countries from essentially defaulting and probably leaving the Eurozone. Faced with that stark choice, because of the political dynamics that Juan mentioned, policymakers have stepped forward and said, you know what, we do need to do something to patch this thing together. I would highlight one important point, which is around about June of this year, I think the atmospherics in the Eurozone changed a little bit, because it went from a sort of firefighting mode to a slightly more strategic way of thinking. And I would highlight there the decision at the end of June in the European Council, where the 17 heads of government of the Eurozone countries come together and make decisions, where they signed on to a document called Towards a Genuine Economic and Monetary Union. Those are their words. In other words, they were admitting that this monetary union is flawed, it needs to be fixed, and they laid out a plan to do that. It's a four-plank plan. First one is to implement banking union. They're arguing about that at the moment. The second is to move towards fiscal union, magic words, mutualization of debt, maybe eventually Eurobond issuance, to move towards greater economic union, and to give political legitimacy to the whole exercise, because you cannot have fiscal union without having some form of increased political union. That's a four-plank plan laid out in June, and really we're in the process of seeing that being implemented. However, health warning, that is a 10-year plan. And this is part of the point I think I'd need to get across to a US-based audience. I think a lot of people on this side of the Atlantic look at Europe and say it's a train wreck in slow motion and the Eurozone's going to break up. And that may well happen, who knows? But what I think is important to realize here is this is a constitutional form of government. Americans understand the power of constitutions. 17 countries, or in fact 27 countries, if we include the European Union, have entered into treaties which bind them together in various ways. First of all, monetarily, not so much fiscally or politically, but those changes may be coming, at least if we believe what policymakers are telling us. Problem is, the policymaking horizon is a 10-year horizon. The number of things that can go wrong are manifold, and markets, of course, have much, much shorter horizons. So this is going to take a while to play out. Let me just touch very briefly on the two other points, the US and China. It's all about the fiscal cliff in the US. The US, again, GDP fell about 4.5% in the crisis. It's now about 2% above the pre-crisis level. So there has been a bit of a recovery. Are you better off than you were 4 years ago? Well, in GDP terms, certainly you are. What's the problem? The problem is the fiscal cliff. But let me set that in a slightly broader setting here. And we heard some comments from other panelists, which I wouldn't necessarily totally agree with, which is you have to understand, in a financial crisis of the form that we saw in 2008, things happen. What happens? Companies pull back on investment. Households pull back on housing investment. And because you'd had this credit and housing bubble, and house prices fell now 35% from the peak, households in particular entered a multi-year debt deleveraging cycle. If you add all that up, what that means is, in GDP terms, that the desired net savings savings minus investment in the private sector suddenly went up because of the financial crisis. Now, there's a law of economics, it really comes from GDP accounting, that the private sector and the public sector cannot both increase their net savings at the same time. They cannot both delever at the same time unless the rest of the world absorbs the net savings that is so generated. That's not Keynesian economics, that's just the law of economic gravity. So what that means is, because the rest of the world, in the circumstances of 2008 and 2009, could not absorb the desired net private savings that most of the developed world suddenly wanted to generate, budget deficits had to go up, and they did go up dramatically. So I think it's very misleading, as many commentators do, to look at the blowout in budget deficits in the US, in Europe, in Japan, around the developed world and say, oh, big deficits, very bad, big government, very bad, we must clamp down on that. Because I would just cite Keynes's fallacy of paradox of the paradox of the thrift, which basically says everybody can't save more at the same time, you'll just drive yourself into depression. Of course, budget deficits need to be brought under control eventually, but you need to do two things. Get the economy back to full employment, full operating capacity, and then tackle the longer-term fiscal consolidation issues. Separate the short-term, medium macro policy management from the longer-term agenda. It's in nobody's interest to drive the economy into recession because of overzealous desire to front-load fiscal tightening, a little bit like the European situation. That's what the fiscal cliff is all about, because at the end of this year, going into next year, there will be a series of fiscal consolidation measures, tax hikes, expiry of the Bush-era tax cuts, expiry of the payroll tax holiday, and expenditure cuts, particularly the sequestration, which would amount to probably 3% of GDP. There's different calculations for that, and would essentially push the economy into recession. That doesn't make any sense. It should be avoided. It probably will be avoided. But as has been alluded to on the panel already, that is casting a huge pall of uncertainty over the economy. How can companies plan or implement investment in this current environment if they don't know, A, whether the economy will be forced into recession in the first quarter of next year or not, and B, even if it's not, what tax policy will look like?
Paul, I think we're going to have
So I'll leave it there. I'll leave maybe China for the discussion.
There's some questions. Yes, first question. And if we're going to have each panelist talk, I'm going to say they have to be very brief.
One word answer.
Deflation.
Neither one. How many years? How many years? Inflation.
Deflation.
Deflation.
Okay, that's 3 out of 4. Yes. You speak up.
Everywhere I look, it's obvious that there are problems. The question is whether these problems are going to materialize very quickly or they're going to materialize over a long time period. From an investment standpoint, people hope that these problems work themselves out over a long time as opposed to an immediate crisis. What kind of assurance, why would anyone be assured that these problems are going to work themselves out over decades in sort of a controlled fashion than an immediate crisis of some kind?
I'm going to give that question to Marc.
Thanks for the easy one.
Well, you started with the big picture. I mean, historical relevance and stuff, significance.
Yeah, my sense is something like this, that it's not a question of quarters. We should be, as investors, we should be thinking about a prolonged period of low returns. And I think of one rule, one kind of like metric, is that the real 10-year yield, relatively the long-term bond yield, is relative. You can use that as a proxy for growth. And the markets is basically saying that we should not expect the kind of growth that we had, say, earlier this decade, or even in the 90s, to be repeated anytime soon. So the market is already bracing for a prolonged period of low growth. I suspect that we could argue that it's also projecting low inflation for the next several years. So it's not a quarterly
expectations of the market.
Expectations of the market, yes.
Yep. Yes.
Given the fact that
Speaker, microphone's coming.
Given the fact that this country, from its inception until President Reagan, developed $1 trillion of publicly traded debt, and currently we're in excess of $16 trillion, and the deficit is over $1 trillion a year, how do you not apply the law of compound interest to this current problem?
Go ahead.
Thanks, Archie.
And I'm not necessarily going to go across.
So, in response to the previous question and on this point, I think we're in a very artificial environment right now. The Federal Reserve has pegged the interest rate at 0 and is buying bonds from the government. And so that's never happened. Neither point of that has ever happened. So I think it's a relatively short-term crisis that we're in. I call it crunch points here in September, where Europe's cash flow won't be sustainable. And on the U.S. side, the tax increase is so big that it points toward a really big recession with no government leadership showing to try to stop that. So as far as how then can you square that with the low interest rates that the U.S. is paying, I put that to the world demographics. So we have a rapidly aging global population that needs bonds. So they're tending to buy bonds from the big countries, us and Germany and France, and then the market is singling out the weaker countries, and they're blowing up. So that's Spain, Greece, and so on. And so it will come to us. But for right now, I don't think we're at a tipping point into a financial crisis. We're at a tipping point into a global recession that will strain social. We're seeing the rioting in Spain. I think that kind of problem is going to get worse in this, rather than focus on our bond yield.
I would agree with that. Yes. I think we have a microphone behind you.
Okay. So I want to pick up on something Mr. Chandler said and Mr. Campanero, and this is about jobs. So there are roughly 500 million workers in the West. We have about 1 billion workers in the cities in the developing countries. 1.5 million in the rural areas who are moving into the urban areas. Those people make a fraction of what the Western workers do. So as these curves ramp up on the other side and ramp down on our side, it seems to me that in the West we are headed, Mr. Campanero, where Belgium is, where 45% of the people under 55 don't work. Can you just explain where the jobs are going to come from, what the future is in both these areas?
Juan, you can crack with that.
Okay. Another easy one. Well, part of what is happening is really this redistribution of economic activity and influence to a different parts of the world. And that's more of an underlying structural changes, partly associated with globalization, have led to this build-up in leverage and indebtedness and lower growth in some of the major economies. Now we're in the midst of a deleverage process that, going back to some of the points raised in the previous questions, are never a pretty picture. They tend to be painful and slow, and they lead you to many, many years of quite low growth. The average deleverage cycle tends to last around 5-6 years, but it can take a lot longer, like the Japanese experience shows. In terms of generating the degree of economic activity that might, trying to manage demand, the problem in most countries in the Western world is that we have already fired all our bullets on the fiscal front and the monetary front. So we are almost out of policy options. So what else we can do? I mean, we have a few rounds of QE already. They didn't do the job. I mean, they prevented a total implosion of the economy and the financial system, but they have not put our economies back on a sustainable higher growth path. So yes, we're in a bit of trouble.
Question: right after the 2000 and after the crisis, there was concern about protectionism rearing its head. And in light of the question and your comment, what's the, I just throw the question at the panel, what's the likelihood of, if we have a second dip here, of that raising its head again and becoming a real issue?
My sense is that sort of like a family. You know, Canada is the U.S. biggest trading partner, and yet we constantly have trade tensions with our friendly neighbors to the north. Trade tensions go with free trade. I think there's a constant threat of protectionism in general, but it stays below the surface. I know the Brazilian finance minister has once again raised the idea of a currency war. I think I tend not to believe that, but I think if we do see that kind of protectionism, that threat of protectionism materialize, I think that's a much greater case for the currency wars. But right now, I'd say that what we're trying to do on a global scale, leaving aside the Doha round of WTO, we're trying to make room at the economic table for this huge giant, China. And it's being a very disruptive force globally. And I think this is the challenge. It's not protectionism per se, but it's, I think, trying to keep the integration of China into the world economy as least disruptive as possible. I think generally speaking, and this maybe addressed the previous question as well, the Boston Consulting Group had done a study last year. They say by 2014 or 2015, Chinese wages will be above Mexico's wages for the first time. So China's role in the competitiveness of the world economy is changing. They're losing competitiveness as inflation and wages rise in China. Those low wage jobs are moving elsewhere in the world. Some of them moving interior to China, but others, like in Mexico, for example, are going to see China being a huge investor in the Maquiladora area so they can export from Mexico into the United States. So I'd say that protectionism remains a constant threat. That's why, in my mind, I think that the strategy is not export-oriented like Germany has, China has, Sweden, Switzerland, but foreign direct investment. Locate plant and production, so service your local markets locally. This is, I think, the real key to what's happening in the United States, like the Japanese automakers. The biggest competition for Detroit is no longer Tokyo. It's Nashville or Kentucky or California, where the Japanese are producing cars. So I think this really changes the texture or the contours of global competition and protectionism.
Archie, can I mention one other point on that? In Europe, they're backsliding. So the European common market is critical to global growth because they can trade across borders. And what's happening now is the interbank market has completely stopped functioning at this level of interest rates. And the current account deficits that Italy and Spain and so on are running are being routed through the European Central Bank. So we have a massive backsliding in Europe on this critical issue of trade liberalization that will hurt all those economies, but then it also indirectly hurts the U.S. quite a bit.
I think we have time to squeeze in one more question if there is one. Yes, and then I think we must change panels.
Could I ask?
Yeah, coming.
Could I ask, based on what you know of the candidates, what difference will it make who gets elected?
I can maybe answer this in a short way for myself. I can't speak for anybody else, but I think that perhaps at lunch today you'll be offered Pepsi and Coke.
I would answer it, not being a panelist, I would answer it that with the gridlock in Washington, if it remains gridlock, I'm not sure it makes a whole lot of difference.
I'll answer it differently. I think there really is a choice between bigger government and smaller. Within the panel, you heard a lot of discussion about what's going on in Europe, and the fight is Europe is trying to radically expand their government through Brussels, meaning these layers and layers of fiscal union. And there's a battle. The people, they never put it to the people for a vote. And so that's the battle going on there, and we have the same one going on here.
Thank you, panelists, very, very much.